questions on the study guide. And we've defined creativity as the creation of something new and useful. The next questions deal with critical thinking. And we've talked about that way of thinking where you start at one point, and critical thinking is a step-by-step analysis that arrives at one right answer. And so you connect the dots. When I say step-by-step analysis to arrive at one right answer, you've experienced this as 1, 2, 3, the number line, calendar 2020, 2021, 22, 23. You might think A, B, C, D. When a teacher says, I want you to show me the steps in order to get to the answer, and you can't jump just to the answer, you have to show the steps. That's an insistence on critical thinking. Now, critical thinking is great when you need one right answer. For example, if I have 1 plus 1, there's one right answer. It doesn't equal 11 because if it did, I'd have a lot of money in my checkbook, right? And so the answer to 1 plus 1 is 2. So there are certain times when critical thinking really is called for. But when you do it step by step, you have to break it down into bits. So you break things down. And you break them down into smaller parts. So that you can analyze them. Now that's really great when this is appropriate, but there's other ways of thinking other than critical thinking. And so you might, for instance, when you're online, you might start at point A or the first point, and you might go to a link, and you might then go to a couple of other links off of that link, and you might visit a couple of the sites, and then you might go back to your original link and go to another link. You might start exploring links, and different links lead you to different places, and at some point you remembered your history, so you go back to the original link, or you backtrack and follow another link. So when you're online and you're following links, you're not going step by step. You might be even jumping around. And yet this makes sense. You can go back in your history. You understand the links that you're doing. It's just that you're not going step by step. So this encompasses one type of creative thinking. Creative thinking connects ideas, sees relationships, puts pieces together, not apart. It strives to see the bigger picture. Now, there are other ways other than what I just showed you to talk about creative thinking. Of course, these are just, examples. But one of the things you might have already experienced is that you've been schooled in 1, 2, 3, answers questions 1 through 4, show me your process, A, B, C, D. You've been trained in this a lot. However, this is the way you naturally think. The internet was based on the way you naturally think. That's why this type of thinking can seem more effortless. And because you live in the time that you do, your brain is more used to seeing links that connect. Okay. Now, in this way of thinking, it's what I call the links but no chain. Like I go step by step by step, and I might be able to see how those links go together. But in this way, I connect things in a lot of different ways. Okay. So you may have the feeling where when a teacher wants you to slow down and do things step by step and break things down into smaller parts, and you want to jump over here to the big picture, It may be because your brain has been conditioned to think like this with the internet by connecting things and seeing relationships and putting things together to fill in the bigger picture. You might be more comfortable with this, and this feels a little bit more like forced thinking. I'm not saying that's the case in all scenarios. I'm just saying that you have a lot of experience, more than you think, with this kind of creative thinking. So let's talk about the connection between these. Step by step, breaking it down into smaller parts, arrives at one right answer. Connecting ideas, seeing relationships may have many right answers. Now, there are a lot of questions that have many right answers where the answers may not conflict. This is one right answer. Sorry, I should have written that. Okay. Sorry, one right answer. I was thinking about the next thing I was going to say to you. Okay, one right answer. So closed-ended ideas where there's one right answer, critical thinking. Many right answers might be climate change. It might be what kind of job, how to write a resume. There might be many right answers for this. Now, they need each other. The relationship between critical and creative thinking is that they need each other. If you think about it, critical thinking would include the scientific hypothesis, right? And you don't just go step by step because you already know the answer. You have to create a hypothesis. You make an observation, you create a hypothesis, you test your hypothesis. Well, right in there, you have the word create a hypothesis. So critical thinking needs to see what different ideas are in order to be able to break it down. In creative thinking, let's say that we're talking about art. At the end of making something, we have what we call it critique, a crit. And it might be, I was doodling here, it might be, let's see, the shadows are pretty good, but the eye is a little bit wide. It doesn't have a nose on it. There is, for this particular drawing, one right way to make an eye, because it'll be I'm not going to make 5 drawings of the eyes all at once. So creative thinking ends with finding the right way to do a drawing, for instance. So these two things need each other. Now, one way to think about how you can combine the two and have strengths in both is with a model that we used to call the right and left brain theory. And you may know about this, but it's not a neurological model that I'm doing on brains. It's just a thinking model. So this idea is that on the right side of the brain, you have these brain functions that see colors, shapes, connections. The right side here is emotional. It sees the gray area instead of black and white. Instead of answers, it looks for questions. Okay. This is also relationships, how things go together, right? Now, on this side of the brain, it tends to be more 1, 2, 3, right, wrong, black, white. Instead of colors, shapes, and emotions, it tends to be your 3 R's, your reading, writing, and arithmetic. I think you get the idea. Now, really, you don't just think on one side of your brain or the other side of your brain. You go back and forth. You might start in one area, like if you're a very logical, organized person, you might start over here. If you tend to like music and are a little bit more in touch with emotions, maybe you like seeing relationships, you might start over here. Either way, you've got to use both sides of your brain, right? You can't just have one side that you're not accessing. I had a friend one time who was a ER doctor, and somebody had taken a gun. Here's a little gun, and had shot somebody in the brain, and they'd come into the ER, and this bullet had severed the hemispheres of the brain. And all of the young doctors were pretty excited because the guy hadn't passed out yet. And so they wanted to, like, before the brain swelling started, they wanted to check him out. It was kind of interesting. They put glasses on him. Here's some eyeballs. Okay. They put some glasses on him and they showed him a newspaper. And when they covered one eye, this is actually cross threaded, so to speak. When they covered one eye, the person could read the newspaper but couldn't tell what the pictures were. They just looked like gray blobs. When they covered the other eye, they couldn't read the newspaper anymore. It just looked like marks, but they could clearly identify the pictures. They then put headphones on his ears. And when they covered one ear, the person could hear the lyrics, but the music sounded like noise. And when they covered the other ear, of course, the lyrics were just gibberish, but they could easily hear the lyrics. And so what happens is you have different places in your brain that assign different functions. If in your brain you're always thinking, this is a metaphor, not a neurological model, but if you're always thinking step by step, in creative thinking, what you're doing is that sometimes you'll be going in different directions. But every time you think about something, you make a neurological connection, a dendrite gets thrown out. And so we know from maybe biology that if I have one area of the brain where I'm thinking a thought, and there's another area of the brain where I'm connecting the thought, this impulse, this electrical impulse that makes an idea, shoots out a dendrite. And that dendrite connects up with another dendrite and has a neural pathway. That's actually how your mind grows, how your thinking grows. People who consistently use one form of thinking may have neural networks that kind of stay the same. They just get to be kind of thinking ruts. And that's because they're always doing step by step, one right answer, one way to think. All right. You may find in creativity that if in your brain, you might be thinking something that's very logical over here, and all of a sudden you get this weird idea, or I show you a picture, or I make a connection, and you'll feel like, aha, like you get this aha moment that we talked about in saturation, incubation, discovery, application, the aha moment. Well, what happens is the further out that dendrite goes, the more you have to jump into a different part of your brain, usually the more creative it is. So, for instance, if I say ballpoint pens are used for writing, then this is like, yes, ballpoint pens are used for writing. But if I say a ballpoint pen can be used as a murder weapon, or a ballpoint pen can be used as a blowgun, then you just made this bigger neural jump where you've seen a connection you've never seen before. So oftentimes creativity is when you connect critical thinking and creative thinking, and you're really using both sides of your brain. You're using an analysis to see a new connection or new relationships, or you might feel like you understand the answer and be able to come back to get where the answer is. So we have this idea here that the two parts of the brain need each other. The critical and creative thinking go together. There are certain times you use critical thinking and certain times you use creative thinking. Now, in an example like this, your left, not your left brain, your critical thinking says this is how you spell I, and your critical thinking says I can make a symbol for an I like this. In creative thinking, I just said, oh, you see relationships, you see the bigger picture, you piece together parts. This way kind of sees a puzzle piece. And actually, I was just doodling there, but when I'm doodling, what I'm actually doing is putting shapes together. So an eye doesn't really look like this. Notice I stopped speaking because my analytical left brain, 3 hours reading, writing, and arithmetic, doesn't function when I go into this alternate mode of thinking. But what I am doing is I'm seeing shapes, and I'm seeing how the shapes all connect. And the shapes are kind of like puzzle pieces, right? This shape and this shape relate or go together. And so, oftentimes in creative thinking, what you'll find is that you're feeling kind of frustrated at first because you can't see the connection. You can't put the pieces together. You're a little bit maybe curious, but you might also be confused. And then all of a sudden, things will come into focus a little more. Now, when we have one right answer, that can be a little bit frustrating because what if your perspective is different from somebody else? And how do we maintain many right answers and use creative thinking, but not have it be unusable, right? You need to be able to use this. So I wanted to introduce you to actually a Hopi Native American idea. Let me get a fresh pencil here when it's sharpened a little bit better for you. And so you're very used to seeing this linear way of thinking. And this has been reinforced a lot. I said that there were more ways to think creatively than this, where you can see relationships and piece together a bigger picture. And there is this Hopi idea called a circle of understanding. And in some Hopi cultures, I might put something in the middle of the circle. And this is a problem. It could be a tribal problem. It could be a personal problem. It could be any numbers of this is just the problem that everybody needs to come together and solve. And so one person might say, well, from my viewpoint, I look at this problem and I see it this way. And there can be somebody over here that says, I really don't see it that way at all. I see it over here. Now, if this is right or wrong, yes or no, then we have a problem because we have two opposing viewpoints, right? And so somebody's got to be right. Well, in this method of understanding, somebody else might come in and go, I'm a Republican conservative and I'm way over here on the right. And through my lens as a Republican conservative on the right, I see it this way. This person might be a liberal socialist and see it from a completely different viewpoint. And in our culture, we might say these conservatives and liberals, they're having a problem here. They're opposite viewpoints. Well, this original person might say, I'm not quite that conservative. I'm halfway in between, but I see it a little differently. And then these two guys have a friend, and this guy's like, I'm siding with him, and I'm siding with him. And then somebody else is like, I see it from this person's viewpoint, and I can see it from this person's viewpoint. So I think I'll moderate a little bit. And what they do is with a group of people, they will go around the circle and everybody will describe what they see. Well, if what you see is an object or a traffic accident or pretty much anything you can select for, what is it that we are looking for? Of course, each different person is going to view it from a different perspective. And so I'm going to see it differently. And so what they do is they wait until everybody has had a chance to put in how they see it. And it can take a while. They're not in any hurry because until everybody says, well, I didn't really understand what I saw, but when I heard this guy talk, and then I realized I didn't think like him, but I thought more like this person. And so I think you get this idea. What happens is they have this big circle of understanding. And you might be ahead of me by now, because what happens at this point is that if you wait long enough and get everybody's viewpoint, and then everybody gets a little feedback as well. So, by the time I tell you how I feel and I get a little bit of feedback on it, and everybody sees where they are in relationship to the problem, and I can see here that I can see it with many right answers because everybody's, trying to give their right answer. Well, what happens is, yes, you guessed it, giant eyeball, right? And so this is called a circle of understanding. And when we have a circle of understanding, what it means is that we're not opposing and saying everybody has to have one right answer, like maybe in math, but that you can have multiple right answers that allow you to see it in a bigger picture. Okay. Now, what I just described with each one of these people is called a conceptual framework. A concept is an idea, right? So a conceptual is how you form your ideas. A conceptual framework is how you form your own individual ideas. These people might have a similar conceptual framework. These people might have a really different conceptual framework. When you put all of these conceptual frameworks, your own individual way of putting something together, when you put it together, you have what's called a cognitive thinking, cognition, panorama. Just like on your phone, you have panorama. There you go. On your phone, you have kind of the big picture, the landscape. So a cognitive panorama is all the different ways to thinking, the whole field of ideas. One I like to use sometimes is 99-cent hamburgers. You would think that a 99-cent hamburger is a really great idea, right? Because what's wrong with a 99-cent hamburger? And as you're thinking about, well, 99-cent hamburger, let's see, it's cheap, feeds my hunger, it goes good with fries. Okay. But I'm like, no, what's wrong with it? And then you're like, well, maybe the fat, maybe it's not the healthiest thing for me to eat. Well, that's a conceptual framework. Maybe it's not that healthy for me to eat, but I like it. Cognitive panorama. Where do they get these burgers from? What do you mean? Well, these burgers are really cheap. It's a 99-cent hamburger. Where do you get 99-cent hamburger? It ain't the grocery store. Well, they have to buy large quantities of cheap beef. Is the US the cheapest place to get beef? Absolutely not. There's got to be other places in the world where you can get beef. Where would be some places where you could get beef cheap? Well, probably not Europe and probably not Japan, and probably not an industrialized place because you need grasslands and you need, areas to grow the cattle in. So you need a large area where you can grow cattle cheap. Well, where might that be? Well, what's happening to the Amazon rainforest? Oh, they're cutting it down in large amounts. What's the matter with cutting it down and doing burn and clear with the Amazon rainforest? Well, it depletes our, ozone and it ruins our planet and it contributes to climate change. Why are they burning down and clear cutting the Amazon rainforest? Well, the Yanomami Indians and other tribal Indians live there, but they don't really own the Amazon rainforest because they don't believe you own nature. And so their governments say, hey, you don't really have a vote. Why don't we just sell out the land to a major corporation? The major corporation comes in and does slash and burn. The Yanomami Indians who live in that rainforest are displaced. They then end up having to work for these, slaughterhouses and factories. And there's a high degree of alcoholism and a high degree of family dysfunction because their entire culture has been ruined by these international companies coming in, slashing and burning their homeland that has been there for generations and ruining their entire worldview just because you can have a 99-cent hamburger. So to a Yanomami Indian, a 99-cent hamburger is the destruction of their culture. To you is the basis for your culture. Sorry to tell you that story, but what I just did was I gave you a cognitive panorama. What are all the different ways to understand something? I am not at all putting down any conceptual framework. I'm just saying that sometimes you think this is the right way to think or the only way to think. And if you allow creative thinking, where you can see a lot of different answers and a lot of different viewpoints, you might not change your conceptual framework, but at least you're more aware of the cognitive panorama. When artists express themselves, whether it's music, or painting, or creating installation environments, they are seeing from their own conceptual framework. They're building that piece of artwork from their own framework of ideas. Janet Eckelman's Secret is Patience. She's really good at explaining her conceptual framework. You might not have ever viewed something through somebody else's eyes like that. You might have never encountered a conceptual framework like that before. So it broadens the cognitive panorama. It gives you a whole landscape of different kinds of ideas. So it's entirely possible to use critical thinking or have a structure to your thinking that seems more analytical, but there's still the benefit of seeing creative ideas because it expands your cognitive panorama, gets you to use different parts of your brain. So I just explained a couple of questions on the study guide, and I hope this made some sense to you. I like to visually think with you. I'm visually thinking here for your right brain, and I'm trying to stay a little bit more analytical for your left brain so that you integrate it a bit more. So I hope you saw things a little bit better in this video, and I hope it helps you on the Creative Study Guide. Thanks for listening.